Made with Spoken. William Rand's Tale by V. James and Amanda Iverson. Digital narration performed by Billy Oxley, 11 Labs. The old town stood before us in the noonday sun, its wooden buildings beaten down by time and weather, the walls of a general store, a livery, and about a dozen other buildings were the only ones still standing that looked like anything. The other houses and structures were just mounds of splintered wood with prairie grass and scrub oaks growing up between the boards and around the foundations. The doctor sat on the wagon bench silently taking in the sight of this once bustling community. When he spoke, it was in a low whisper, awestruck. "This is it, Willie. This is Jack Brown's town. Goodwind, or Godwin, as they later came to call it. 350 people, more or less, called this place home for better than 165 years, lived, grew up, and died here. Then the town itself died." Hey, you! We both turned to look toward the voice. An old geezer with a nasty-looking double-barreled shotgun was approaching us. He held the gun level with his waist as he trudged slowly across the sandy ground. The doctor smiled and waved, his face open and confident. "How do?" "How do, my ass," swore the old-timer. "Just who the hell do you think you are?" The doctor kept smiling. "I'm glad you came along. We need to talk to you." "That so?" wheezed the man. "What for?" "We were wondering who we had to pay to look for artifacts in this area." The farmer, if that's what he was, stared back at him, red-eyed and at least half drunk. The doctor continued in that smooth, easy voice of his. "You know, the odd piece of metal or souvenir left by someone here a long time ago. You a lawman?" The shift in the shotgun's angle was a menacing movement not lost on the doctor. "No, sir, a police officer wouldn't bring a boy along, now would he?" said the doctor, indicating me. He slowly lowered himself down from the wagon. $35. "Huh?" "I'll pay you $35 for 10 days. If we have to stay past that, I'll make it an even 40. $40, I gasped inwardly. I never would have guessed he would pay that much. And here he was, only paying me $1 a day to haul around his heavy satchel, move trunks that weighed more than I did, drive the mules, and do anything else he needed done. Even that money didn't wind up in my pocket, for the doctor was sending it back to my folks in Missouri. "Well, old-timer, what do you say? Deal?" A broad smile cracked across the weathered face of the farmer like a trench being dug across this barren plain. The twin barrels dipped toward the ground. "You got a deal, mister. You're going to need some water out here. I'll send my boy up with a barrel later." "Mighty generous, sir," said the doctor as he reached into his knapsack. The farmer's face fell, and his grip on the stock of the gun tightened. The archaeologist caught this movement out of the corner of his eye and continued to dig slowly into his bag. "Ah, here it is." He produced a bottle of frothy liquid which glowed bright gold in the afternoon sun. "Now how about a drink to seal the deal, my friend?" That same toothless grin grew wider, and the farmer relaxed. The doctor tossed a look over at me. "Willie, I want you to start setting up our camp over yonder, under those oaks. Take care not to set out the trunks until you've got a good cover for them. I'll be along shortly to help." "Yes, sir," I said. The wagon creaked and clattered as I drove the mules over to the stand of trees. I glanced back and watched for a minute as the old-timer threw his head back and took a long draw off the bottle. The doctor was standing there in that relaxed way of his, smiling and talking. One thing's for sure, that old farmer went away with a smile on his face and a fire in his belly. $40. By the time we built up a shelter, unloaded the wagon, and finished setting up camp, the late-day sun burned across the plain straight at us. I was chipping kindling off of some mesquite when I heard a wagon coming. A boy about my own age drove, and he stared at us until he got close. Then he dropped his eyes and never once looked back up. The barrel was heavy, and it took all three of us to roll it onto our wagon without letting it topple over. The doctor and I both tried to talk to him, but the boy was awfully quiet, saying "yes, sir," and "no, sir" to the doctor, and nothing to me. As he drove away, the doctor said, "I guess if you don't live around other folks, you just don't know how to talk to them." I thought he must be right. The town's buildings had seemed warm and almost alive when we first saw them, but now, In the deepening twilight, they took on a dull gray visage, like a group of old ghosts doomed to sit in crumbling council on the lonesome prairie of West Texas. As he had done each night we had been on the trail, the doctor lit a traveling oil lamp and began to study one of the large books he kept in the heavy trunks. A few times I had glanced in at the pages, but there were few pictures, and the letters were packed closer together than the freckles on my cheeks. I could see all the letters I knew, and then some, but I knew to wait, just like I had all the other nights. After a while he began to mumble and turn the pages back and forth as if he was comparing what he'd seen on one page to the other. And as I settled down to sit by the fire, he started reading and talking out loud. Righteous men were brought forward unto the flame and told to drink deeply of the blood of ages. Cantilevered above the pit, their screams were echoing across the valley, drawing pale as the sacrifice of these innocent men. Now wait, there's an inconsistency. The account of 1850 mentions no such mechanics, simple rope and wood that burned with equal ferocity. Ah, that's it. Wooden pulleys doubled to produce a cantilever effect, I see. I did not fully grasp all the meanings and often found myself dazed by the many words, but I knew that if I listened long enough, I would begin to understand. It was the same as a few weeks before, when he was reading from a book, just as he was now. All of a sudden I knew. I understood what he was saying. He had been reading about wagon wheels and how they turned around over and over, and I thought he was going on about something so dull, when suddenly I realized that he was not just talking about the wheels, but the motion they were making, the number of times they turned, and how to measure distance that way. It had been like a door opening in my mind, and the importance of the matter had become clear. To learn something so mighty from an ordinary object made me see that learning was not the property of the already educated person, but for anyone who cared to listen and think. I was mighty proud of myself that day, and resolved to pay attention when the doctor shared his wisdom. The next morning, after we had some coffee and hardtack, the doctor had me follow him up the sloping hill west of the old town. I held the end of a tape as he marched with measured step across the field, counting loudly 1, 2, 3, until he reached 100. He drove a little stake into the sandy soil, marked it with some writing, and then had me come to that spot, from whence he began the whole process over again. All day in the prairie heat, we went like that. The doctor never seemed to tire, but he did allow for water breaks and an apple at noon. It was not until late that day, when we had gone nearly all the way around the town, that he called a halt to our work. I think it was because I had dropped the tape twice, but the doctor showed no real anger. He just said, "Okay, my boy, let's pack it in." The let's part of that was something of an overstatement, since he simply picked up his satchel and headed in toward camp, leaving most of the equipment for me to carry. When I finally trudged in, though, I was rewarded with the smell of a delicious stew boiling in the kettle and a huge pot of coffee brewing. As we ate and rested our weary legs, the doctor looked over at me and said, "Willie, I want you to think carefully before you answer this question." I nodded. "Okay, here goes," he continued. "Today we begin our study of this place. We have made, or almost finished anyway, a large square around the town. Now think, Willie, why would we do that?" I have to admit I was so distracted by the pains in my legs and my exhaustion that at first I could not see any way to answer him. He waited until he saw that the confusion was not going to clear up on its own. He cleared his throat, and it made me sit up straighter. I mumbled out a reply. I just can't think right now, sir." "Now, Willie, I want you to listen to me. When a man is tired and ready to give up, that's when the worst things will strike. Just now, if some Apache warriors came over that ridge, whooping and hollering and shooting arrows at us, you'd come awake now, wouldn't you?" I immediately agreed I would. So, when you are tired and ready to lie down and rest, just remember, that's when you might need your mind in the worst way. Give yourself something to think about, and it will keep you sharp as a tack, even when your body is resting, you see. I thought I understood. The doctor got a stick and drew in the dirt. "Now see here. This is the livery, this is the barn next to it, and over here is the old store. There's the bank, a barber, and I think another dry goods store here. There are a few houses down this way, and more over here. I think the old jail is somewhere in here, and the cemetery is going to be a little ways out, say here." Then he bent over with the stick and drew a big square all the way around the dirt map of the town and drew connecting lines across it like a checkerboard. He looked up at me, his eyes twinkling in the firelight. "You see? What we are making is called a grid. It's the way an archaeologist studies an area. If we find anything interesting, we will be able to mark its exact location on a map of the town." He sat back and tossed the stick into the fire. "Better get some shut-eye, Willie. We have a lot of work to do tomorrow." I was relieved that he had no more chores for me that day and gratefully crawled into my bedroll. As I drifted off to sleep, I could hear the doctor beginning to read aloud again. His voice seemed far off and carried into my dreams. When I awoke the next morning, the doctor was already quite busy, going through some of his great trunks and removing some of his equipment. Many of the devices he took out were from the bottom of the trunks, and I guessed he rarely used them. Some even had their own carved wooden boxes lined on the inside with rich velvet. I was aware that he had let me sleep longer than usual, so I hurried to get up, wash my face, and then went without being asked to get a load of wood. He was setting up one of his instruments when I returned. I set the wood down and went over to where he was using the back of the buckboard for a table. The little machine had a top that looked like a triangle made of small brass pieces, with a square base painted to look like the face of a compass. He was concentrating, carefully making tiny adjustments to several brass knobs on the base. As he turned the knobs, the triangle would tilt this way and that, and I figured he was trying to adjust the machine so that it pointed straight up. "Come on, come on," he breathed as he applied slight pressure to one of the knobs. The triangle slowly swiveled toward the center, but a minute gust of wind sent it wobbling wildly. The doctor stood up, shaking his head with disgust, and stretched his back. He'd been in the same position for a long time, and I heard a few pops as his backbone settled. "Here, Willie," he said. "Stand there. No, a little more left. There, that's it. Now don't move. Stand there." With the breeze now blocked, he was able to do what he said was calibrating. Only years later, when I worked with some surveying equipment, did I truly understand how vital calibration was. A little later, when the afternoon sun was beating down on us, and I'd finished the last of my chores, I got a drink of water and looked across the wide valley. The doctor was preoccupied with a large book. The insects were singing in great choruses, and all I wanted to do was crawl into the shade of the oaks and sleep through the heat. The doctor stopped me. "No, Willie, I want you to stay awake as long as you can today. Come on, fill 2 of those canteens and let's take a walk." We made our way across the prairie grasses and down the long slope toward Godwin. Looking at those old buildings made me glad the doctor had chosen the campsite he had. It was good to be near the stand of trees, but I was even happier that we were far from the ruins of the old town. Even in the daylight, I felt there were eyes upon me. Being with the doctor was some comfort, but I doubted that even he could protect us from the evil I was certain was following our every move. I did not share these fears with him, but kept them to myself. The doctor seemed to be casually strolling as if we were on a Sunday afternoon promenade through the streets of another living town, on our way to a church social. I laughed at this, and the doctor looked at me and smiled, but then dropped back into his own reverie. The walk took my thoughts back to St. Joseph, Missouri, when my family would gather every Sunday for a huge supper. Mama would set out great pawns of fried chicken, coleslaw, and corn pudding she'd made that day. Granny always had the vegetable plates, each one trimmed and arranged on the beautiful cut-glass platters she'd gotten somewhere in Carolina. I smiled, remembering the deviled eggs, sweet potatoes, and collard greens. It was the best food I've ever had. My daddy would buy a great block of ice for the older kids, and we would spend the morning chipping off pieces for cold lemonade and tea. In the late afternoon, Granny would bring out a little metal barrel filled with a thick pink mixture, and we'd put it into a special wooden bucket that had a crank on the side. We would stuff layers of ice and salt all around the little barrel, and the kids, starting with the youngest, would turn the crank round and round. We would spell each other until none of the kids could turn it any more. Then Daddy and my uncles would take over turning the crank until finally they would announce that it was done. Of all the tastes of summer watermelons, fresh vegetables, or summer corn, nothing could compare with the exquisite taste of Granny's homemade strawberry ice cream. Both of my parents were still alive in the days I traveled with the doctor, but times were hard, and the money he sent back to them helped to get the family through. I think Daddy knew that the hard work I did for the doctor would also get me an education. I was much beholden to my pa for that and determined to learn all I could, as I thought that I'd never have the chance to step into a schoolhouse. Many years later, when I attended my first indoor school, I realized that although I knew little of the particulars of school life, my hard-working ways and determination would make schoolwork seem just like building a rock wall or raising a cabin. It was performing one step at a time, everything done in order, that made a great job small. Many times I thanked both my daddy and the doctor, for they taught me the most important lesson, that a solid foundation, whether it was that of a building or the knowledge of the alphabet and reading, made the rest of the construction sound. Our walk took us down the main street of Godwin, and I think now how often we walked that same way. It was as if the doctor were trying to place each building back in its original place and condition. He would point to an old pile of wood and say, "There was the watchmaker," or "A hotel stood here, giving shelter to weary pioneers crossing the plains." We reached the midtown square and paused as the doctor took from a leather satchel the map he'd been working on since we had completed the grid work. Most of the old buildings here were still standing, save for one group that had gone down in a fire. "That may have been a lightning strike," he said. The doctor had penned a perfect rendering of the town, a map that along its borders contained copious notes on Godwin and its former inhabitants. To the north was the only truly steep place here, the ground giving way to a sharp rise that ended in cliffs above that part of the old town. All the other directions were long, sloping grasslands. The doctor led us to the north side, now off the overgrown streets, and picking his way along narrow traces between the ruined houses. "Don't step out onto any of these old boards, Willie," he warned. I wouldn't have anyway, for I had seen hundreds of rusted nails poking out of them, and the doctor had told me how just one nail piercing a boot could lead to lockjaw, fever, and death. He stopped again to study the map, and I could see lines where we had laid the grid, with the doctor pointing out where prominent buildings had stood. The images and drawings on the map, I was beginning to learn how to read them and starting to put together a picture in my mind of how the town would have looked in its heyday, all new and freshly whitewashed. While the doctor made a few new marks on the map and read from some old papers, I looked back toward the center of town. I tried to imagine the bank standing near the town square. It had probably been a two-story affair with some fancy woodwork on top. Out toward our camp was where the old stables had stood with their huge barn and corral. It would have been busy on all but the Lord's Day. But I was struck with the thought that of all the places the doctor had pointed out, stables, bank, hotel, houses, and even the old schoolhouse, not once had he so much as mentioned where the town's church had stood. "Doc!" I was careful not to interrupt until he said it was all right. "Yes, Willie, go on," he said, still musing over his map. "Where was the church, sir?" I asked. He looked hard at me, and for a moment I thought I might have asked a foolish question. But something in his kind eyes told me that his mind had seized upon the question, and I would have to wait for his reply. He carefully put the map down on the ground and motioned for me to kneel beside him. "Tell me what you see," he said. I pointed out everything I could and even guessed at a few more things until I caught the grim smile on his face. "Very good," he said quietly. "Very good indeed. You are not only learning, Willie, but you are also learning how to learn." I felt proud, all right, mighty proud. But I could also tell from the doctor's voice that my accomplishment was not the only thing on his mind. His hand swept across the area in front of us. This was the poor part of town, he said, where the Negroes and the servants and poorer farmers lived. The reason is that if the town got a gully washer, these buildings would flood first. He pointed up at the rocky cliff that hung over us. Sometimes rocks, boulders, would fall from up there and crush one of these houses. He looked hard into my eyes. They called it Pigfoot, and they could make anybody they wanted to live here. We looked up to the edge of the cliff again, and our eyes followed the long ridge eastward as it bent down to finally touch the grassy plain. He was silent for a long time, lost in thought. "You asked the right question, Willie, Opraz," he finally said. "The church is the reason I am here, or what the people called their church." He laughed a little, but it wasn't like he was laughing at a joke. "Can you imagine a place called Godwin not having a church?" I gasped. "No church, sir?" The doc gave me a long look. "I'm going to tell you something, son, something that may give you bad dreams, though I reckon it couldn't be much worse than the ones you're already having." My eyes dropped. Either he had guessed at my dreams, or perhaps I had called out in my sleep. "Is that all right?" he asked, and then held up a hand. "You don't have to hear it. Now think before you say." I took a deep breath and then straightened my back. "Yes, sir," I said. "I can hear it." "All right." He folded his map and papers and placed them back into the satchel. "But not just yet. Let's hoof it back to camp. I can't seem to find what I was looking for anyway." "What was that, sir?" "A well that the settlers dug when they got here. They used it for many years, but if it was over in this area, the weeds have long since covered it up." The late-day sun cast long shadows as we trudged back through Godwin. Somehow it made the walls that still stood look even bigger, but the wood took on a warm amber hue, and for once the normally gray walls did seem as cold and dead as they had before. I felt myself falling to sleep even before my head came to rest on the roll of canvas I used as a pillow. I hoped that tonight I would sleep without any more of the strange dreams, but that was not to be. I was in the streets of Godwin, surrounded by the people who lived there, or once had lived there. The buildings all stood as if newly built, and there was the smell of fresh horse manure, perfumed ladies, the acrid smell of a nearby sawmill, and the familiar dust of the prairie. At first I thought I was in the town on fair day, so closely were the people packed along the street. But then one of them yelled at me, calling me a name I did not understand. He reached out and gave me a tremendous push, and I fell back against the crowd behind me. They gave way, and I stumbled back a few steps before I fell back first onto the ground, skinning one elbow. The crowd around me reacted with hoots and hollers and cries of, "Stand up, you heathen! Back on your feet!" Suddenly, the crowd fell back, split in two, by something coming in from the blackest part of the prairie. All I could see was the vague shadow of a huge man walking toward me in great, slow steps that shook the ground with each pace. I raised my eyes, trying to see the face of the man, but instead fixated on the two pools of darkness that were its eyes. They were the deep black eyes of some unnatural beast, something not of the world of men. The eyes seemed to suck in the light from all around, creating twin whirlpools of blackness. The eyes pulled me, or rather pulled my mind toward them. But I knew if I allowed myself to be drawn in, there would be no return to this world. I wanted to cry out to the doctor to save me, but my throat was tight, and I was having trouble breathing. I was gasping, struggling to get my breath, and once again I felt the blackness come over me, and I made a clawing gesture, trying to reach the top of the well I thought I was in. My hand contacted something hard, and the sudden pain snapped me out of the dream, a heavy, dull pain coming from the side of my hand. When I came out of my sleep, I was standing up, and the first sensation my conscious mind grasped was a wave of cold coming from my bare feet. They hurt terribly, and I looked to see they were cut and bleeding. There was a stinging pain coming from my right foot, but it was too dark to see what was causing it. Then I raised my eyes and realized I was standing in front of the remains of the old general store, the last vestiges of the wall leaning over my head like a great hand, reaching out to seize me. I yelped and jumped back, looking wildly about. It was still in the deepest hours of the night, and I was standing in the middle of Godwin, its ruined walls rising around me like sentinels who had discovered an intruder. I had walked here in my sleep, oblivious to the rocks and brambles tearing at my feet. I shivered both from cold and fright, and it was difficult to force myself to move at all, let alone begin to walk. I felt that if I looked in any direction, I would see something looking back at me, and I did not want to feel those whirlpool eyes again. I took a faltering step, and it made the next one easier. Though my limbs felt icy, petrified with fear, moving was the only recourse I had. I felt as though hundreds of eyes were upon me, and something was silently moving right behind me. With great effort of will, I glanced back, but my gaze was met only by the shadowy gray images of the dying buildings. In a sudden mad moment, as if to avoid invisible hands reaching for me, I cried out and began to run down the old street, calling out for the doctor. I realized that the camp lay to my left, and I plunged across the open ground, hoping I had not guessed wrong. If I had felt nothing walking in my sleep, I think I felt twice as much pain going back. Rocks cut at my heels, sharp points of grasses stabbed at me, and there were stings and pains I could not identify. But I ran as anybody would with the threat of death behind him, and stumbled headlong without so much as pausing. Twice I fell, once causing a severe shock of pain to one knee. But each time I sprang up and ran forward again, as though the devil himself was at my heels. I was still calling out hoarsely as I approached the camp, and I could make out the doctor rising and coming forward with his rifle. "What's chasing you, boy?" he shouted, as he came across the camp, pointing the big gun out into the darkness. I collapsed on the hard ground, breathless and terrified. It took a good while and a long drink of water before I could speak. I told the doctor about waking up in the town and then began to feel foolish. I decided it would be best not to talk about what had been in my nightmare. The doctor had me sit up in the wagon, and he tended the wounds on my feet, pulling many slivers and brambles from beneath the skin, washing my feet, and applying a salve before binding them in fresh white bandages. Soon the trembling of my fear spoke for me. In a quiet tone that spoke like a command from the Almighty, Doc said, "Tell me what you saw." My resolve crumbled. I saw eyes, I managed, in my dream before I woke up out there. Black eyes that weren't human. They were pulling at me, sir, trying to drag me down into something dark. The doctor's face grew grim. He stood and walked to the edge of our camp, staring out toward the dark silhouette of Godwin. When he spoke, his voice was different, harder, like a man preparing for battle. "I should have known," he said quietly. "The stories about this place, I thought they were exaggerations, folklore built up around a simple tragedy." He turned back to me. "Willie, I need to tell you about Godwin now, about what they did here." He sat down again and poured himself some coffee, though his hands, I noticed, were not quite steady. This town wasn't founded by good Christian folk looking for a new start. Jack Brown and his followers were what some would call a cult. They believed they could achieve immortality through certain rituals. Dark practices, Willie. Blood sacrifices. They performed them in what they called their church, up against that cliff wall. My stomach turned cold. The town grew because they needed it. To more people meant more potential sacrifices. The account I've been reading describes how they would take the poor folks, the ones living in Pigfoot, and use them in their ceremonies. But something went wrong in 1855. Whatever they were trying to summon or control, it turned on them. Within a week, every soul in Godwin was dead. Some say they killed each other. Others say something else did the killing. He looked at me hard. I came here to prove it was just mass hysteria, some kind of poisoning or disease. But, Willie, what happened to you tonight? I think we've stirred something up, something that's been sleeping here for 35 years. We should leave, I whispered. Right now, sir, please. No, he said firmly. If we leave, it will follow. I can feel it reaching for you, Willie. I don't know why, but it's connected to you now. The only way to stop it is to face it, to finish what should have been done decades ago. How, sir? He gestured to his trunks. I've spent 15 years studying the occult practices of ancient peoples. I know the rituals Jack Brown used because they're all written down in the books I've collected. And if I know how they opened the door to this evil, then I know how to close it. He stood and placed a hand on my shoulder. Try to rest, son. Tomorrow night, we're going to end this thing. I did not sleep again that night. Neither did the doctor. When I finally dozed off near dawn, I slept heavily, my body demanding the rest it had been denied. When I woke, the sun was already high, though I could barely tell. Thick gray clouds had rolled in from the west, and a cold wind was blowing hard across the prairie. The temperature had dropped maybe 20 degrees from the day before. The doctor was already up, sorting through his trunks with frantic energy. He had pulled out books, strange instruments, bundles of dried herbs, and small bottles containing various colored liquids. His face was drawn and pale, as if he too had seen something in the night. "Good, you're up," he said without looking at me. "How are your feet?" I stood gingerly. They hurt something terrible, but I could walk. "I can manage, sir." "You're going to have to. We've got a lot to carry into town." My heart sank. "Into Godwin, sir?" "Right into the center of it, the town square. That's where we have to make our stand." Over the next few hours, despite my protesting feet, we made trip after trip from our camp to the middle of Godwin. The wind whipped at our clothes and sent dust devils spinning through the abandoned streets. Each time we entered the town, I felt that same sensation of being watched. But now it was stronger, more insistent. The doctor had me bring specific items: his largest trunk, which required both of us to carry, a leather satchel filled with books, bottles, and pouches of various materials, and his surveying equipment, which seemed an odd thing to bring. By mid-afternoon we had assembled everything in the square. The doctor set up a strange configuration, placing stakes at specific points in a wide circle, connecting them with a white cord. In the very center, he had me put the large trunk, which he opened to reveal more books and what looked like ceremonial objects: a silver chalice, a long knife with symbols etched into its blade, and other items I did not recognize. "Willie," he said as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, "I need you to do something very important. See all these old buildings around us? I want you to start pulling boards off them, the dry ones, and pile them right here in the center of the square. We're going to build a bonfire, a big one." "Yes, sir," I said, though I didn't understand why. "And Willie, once you light that fire tonight, you must not let it go out. No matter what you see or hear, you keep feeding that fire. Do you understand me? It must not go out." The intensity in his eyes frightened me. "I understand, sir." I spent the remaining daylight hours pulling boards from the collapsed buildings. Despite my injured feet, fear gave me strength. I stacked the wood in a great pile, easily 8 feet high, and gathered more boards in smaller piles nearby so I could feed the fire throughout the night. As I worked, the doctor prepared his ritual. He walked the perimeter of his circle again and again, reading from his books, making minor adjustments to the placement of his stakes. He drew symbols in the dirt with a stick, consulting his texts frequently. Sometimes he would speak in languages I did not know, Latin perhaps, or something older. The wind grew stronger as the sun sank lower. The gray clouds had darkened, and there was a smell in the air like before a lightning storm, though I saw no signs of rain. "It's almost time," the doctor said as the last rays of sunlight disappeared. "Light the fire, Willie." I used matches from the doctor's supplies and some kindling I'd prepared. The dry wood caught quickly, and within minutes flames were leaping 10 feet into the air. The fire roared and crackled, and its light pushed back the gathering darkness, illuminating the ruined buildings around us with dancing orange light. The doctor stood within his circle, one of his ancient books open before him on the trunk. He had changed into a long black coat, and he looked older somehow, more grave. "Whatever happens tonight, Willie, stay by that fire. Keep it burning. And if I should fall, you run. You get on that wagon and you don't stop until you reach civilization. Do you understand?" "Doctor, Yeah, do you understand?" "Yes, sir." He nodded once, then turned his attention to the book. He began to read aloud, his voice strong and clear despite the howling wind. The words were like nothing I had ever heard, ancient and powerful. They seemed to resonate in my chest and make the very air vibrate. At first, nothing happened. The doctor continued reading page after page, his voice never wavering. I fed more wood to the fire, keeping the flames high. Then I felt it, a change in the air, a pressure like before a thunderstorm but stronger. The wind suddenly died completely, leaving an eerie stillness. The flames of the bonfire, which the wind should have whipped, now stood almost straight up, unnaturally still. The doctor's voice grew louder, more insistent. He raised one hand toward the sky, the other keeping his place in the book. And Godwin began to wake. It started as a sound, a low moaning that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The old buildings began to creak and shudder, though there was no wind to move them. Boards that had lain still for decades started to shift and scrape against each other. Then I saw them. Figures, translucent and gray as smoke, began to emerge from the buildings. They drifted into the streets, dozens of them. Then hundreds, men, women, children, the dead of Godwin, returning after 35 years. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, but the doctor had told me to stay, and I would not abandon him. I threw more wood on the fire with trembling hands. The spirits drew closer, forming a vast circle around us, just beyond the doctor's protective boundary. Their faces twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. Some reached toward us with phantom hands, and others seemed to be pleading, begging for release. The doctor's voice rose above the moaning of the dead. He was no longer reading from the book, but reciting from memory, his arms raised high. The symbols he had drawn in the dirt began to glow with a faint blue light. Then the temperature plummeted. My breath came out in great white clouds, and frost began to form on the ground. The spirits suddenly parted, creating an opening in their circle. Through that opening came the thing I had seen in my dreams. It was tall, impossibly tall, a figure draped in darkness that seemed to absorb the light from my fire. Where its face should have been, there were those eyes, the black whirlpool eyes that had tried to pull me down. The very sight of it made my knees weak and my vision blur. The doctor never hesitated. His voice thundered out words of power, and the symbols around us flared brighter. The entity stopped at the edge of the glowing circle, and I could feel its rage like a physical force. It spoke then, and its voice was the sound of graves opening, of earth falling on coffin lids, of the last breath leaving a dying man. "You have no power here, learned man. This ground is mine. These souls are mine. The boy is mine." "No," the doctor shouted. "By the names of power, by the laws of the natural world, I command you to depart. These souls are not yours to hold. Release them." The entity laughed, and the sound of it made my ears ache. It reached out one shadowy hand toward the circle, and where it touched, the glowing symbols flickered and dimmed. The doctor's face showed strain, sweat running down his temples despite the freezing air. He reached into his coat and pulled out the silver chalice and the ceremonial knife. "Willie," he said, his voice tight, "no matter what I do now, keep that fire burning. Promise me." "I promise, sir." The doctor raised the knife, and I realized with horror what he intended to do. Before I could cry out, he drew the blade across his left palm. Blood welled up dark in the firelight, and he let it drip into the chalice. "A willing sacrifice," he shouted, "freely given, to undo the unwilling sacrifices forced upon the innocent. By my blood I bind you, by my life I command you, begone from this place." He flung the blood from the chalice toward the entity. The reaction was immediate and terrible. The entity shrieked, a sound that shattered what few windows remained in Godwin. The spirits around us began to wail and thrash. The ground itself shook, and I had to grab onto the woodpile to keep from falling. But the entity was not defeated. It surged forward, breaking through the weakened circle. The glowing symbols went dark, and the protection was gone. "Doctor!" I screamed. The darkness wrapped around him like a shroud. He continued to speak his words of power, even as the entity lifted him off the ground. I could see him struggling, see the terrible toll it was taking, but he did not stop. With his last strength, he pulled something from his coat, a small glass vial containing a liquid that glowed like starlight. He brought it to his lips and drank. "In the name of light," he gasped, "I cast you into the darkness that spawned you." The doctor's body began to glow, softly at first, then brighter and brighter, until I had to shield my eyes. The entity recoiled, but the doctor reached out and grabbed it with both hands, holding it fast. "Willie, close your eyes," he shouted. "Close them now." I squeezed my eyes shut and turned away. Even through my closed eyelids I saw the flash of brilliant white light that turned the night to day. The shrieking reached a crescendo, and then there was a sound like thunder, like the very sky splitting open. Then silence. I opened my eyes slowly. The bonfire still burned, but the spirits were gone. The entity was gone. And in the center of the circle, the doctor lay motionless on the ground. I ran to him, forgetting the fire, forgetting everything. "Doctor! Doctor, please!" He opened his eyes, and I saw that they were peaceful, almost happy. Did I do it, Willie?" "Yes, sir. It's gone. They're all gone." "Good," he whispered. "Good. Listen to me now. You must go on without me. Take the wagon, go to St. Louis, find a man named Carson at the university. He'll help you. Tell him I was right. Tell him it's all real." "No, sir, I won't leave you. You're going to be fine." But even as I said it, I could see the light fading from his eyes. Whatever he had drunk, whatever power he had called upon, it had consumed him from within. "Well, you're a good boy, Willie. You're going to do great things. Learn everything. See everything. Don't let fear—" His voice faded to a whisper. "Don't let fear stop you." His eyes closed, and his chest rose one last time, then fell still. I held him and wept as the fire burned down to embers and the first light of dawn began to show in the east. I buried the doctor in a place I knew he would have liked. It took me most of the next day to get his body wrapped and onto the wagon, and another day to find the right spot. The place I found was a lonely bluff overlooking a large, flat plain. I thought the doc would have liked the place for the view it gave, particularly of the starry sky at night. As I drove away, I got the feeling that it had been a good choice, and I smiled as I remembered things he had said to me. As I drove the wagon out, I saw a lone figure on the road ahead. It was the old farmer's son, with a bundle of possessions slung over one shoulder. His eyes looked into mine as I drew the reins in. We just stared at each other for a minute. I didn't think it'd do any good to talk to him, and he didn't wait for it. He just climbed up onto the seat, and I snapped the horses into motion. My new companion spoke not a word all the way to St. Louis. The end.
The end. We hope you've enjoyed this production of
William Rand's Tale, made with spoken.
Professional audiobooks in a click. Spoken.